Right before we got on the call, Liz sent me a text message saying she'd be on the call soon, but that her husband was trying to explain to her that it's the gay horse in the Narnia books.
Yeah, I was talking about how it was going to be the Satan witch and the Jesus lion. Mm-hmm. And he's like, what about the gay horse? And I'm like, the what now? What are you referencing? The gay horse? And he's like, yeah, the gay horse. And I'm like, sweetheart, have you even read this book? And he's just kind of like, well, it's a fantasy book. It has to have a gay horse in it, doesn't it?
What?
Okay, so there are centaurs in later books, like Prince Caspian, there's centaurs? So does that mean centaurs are gay horses?
Well, I could say something really dirty here, but I'm not going to. What I'm going to say instead is I want to move back to this whole every fantasy story has a gay horse as a trope. Like, he thinks that's a trope. Like, if the fantasy story, then gay horse?
Yeah, because otherwise he cannot explain Geralt the Binacorn from Taz. Because he's like, because they just use all the tropes. So of course there has to be a gay horse somewhere in Narnia. And I'm like, probably.
I just want to shoot off rapid fire fantasy stories at him and to have him tell me who the gay horse is in them. This is amazing. Gay horse.
It's Bill, by the way, in Lord of the Rings.
Well, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Welcome to This Is Lit, a podcast where we drink and talk about our favorite books. I'm Elizabeth.
And I'm Casey.
So raise a glass and let's get started.
Now that we have established that we are clearly in that haze of a place between Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve,
where time does not exist.
What are you drinking?
I'm drinking Diet Coke and vodka. I was going to do a hot toddy, and then I'm like, that sounds too hard.
I'm festive. I got bubbles. Bubbly.
I guess technically
if I drink champagne without stopping from now through midnight of the 31st, that maybe the collective alcohol poisoning will be enough bad karma for the whole world for the next year,
Oh, yes. Taking one for the team.
Like Jesus, I am taking on all the bad karma of the world into myself so that 2021 can be less of a shit show.
Speaking of Jesus, we read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
That was a hell of a segue there, Liz. Thank you.
Everybody knows Aslan is Jesus.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So yeah, in the spirit of the holidays, we decided we would reread The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis.
Yes.
If you don't know what that is,
How?
Well, okay. That's wild. I'm not here to judge, but anyway, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is the second book in the Chronicles of Narnia series. It is a 7-part series by C.S. Lewis.
Though it is the most popular and most widely known.
Yes, he was a contemporary of Tolkien's, and he wrote these books for his children, essentially, like
yes.
Tolkien did Lord of the Rings for his children. But he wrote them out of order. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is the second book in the series chronologically, but it was actually the first one published, and as Liz said, is now the most famous and well-known of the books in the series. Probably because it stands alone best of any of them.
Yeah, it really does. It stands alone best. It has a very concrete first, second, and third act with a very, it's a satisfactory ending, but it still kind of leaves things a little open there towards the end. But it's very much I watched the movie first originally when it came out, and I'm like, oh, this is really nice. I kind of see the correlation between Aslan and Jesus Christ and all that stuff. You saw the
movie before you read the book?
I saw the movie before I read the book.
Oh, holy shit.
Yeah, I was old.
I just worked under I guess we do this usually at the beginning of the episode. So I guess continue with your story. You're saying you saw the movie and then you read the book for the first time when?
After the movie came out, because I enjoyed the movie.
Okay. So how old were you then?
And, well, I guess the first movie I saw was probably not the movie you're thinking of, the one Disney did. The movie I saw was the really bad 70s cartoon version that they showed us in second grade in school. So
you read the book, you were like 9 or 10 then?
Yeah, something like that.
Oh, that makes way more sense. Because I was like, I was like the new.
I was old for these books, but it was
the Walden Media version of Narnia came out in like 2006 or 7. I thought you were saying you were like in high school.
No, not that one. I'm like, is this based off that weird little cartoon that I saw? And then I read the book and I was like, because like when I saw the cartoon, I'm like, oh yeah, because like in school, they couldn't say this was Christian allegory, but they did make hints at it when we were learning about the classics. Because you can't, well, you know, I went to school in Missouri in elementary school. Conservatives rule. And but then when I got the book, I'm like, oh yeah, this is Aslan as Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
It's very obvious in the book, and it's not super obvious when they translate it to a film version, I think, to make it appeal to a wider audience, perhaps.
I mean, I don't 100% agree with you, but I'll get on that in a minute.
Okay.
My story with the Chronicles of Narnia is I was raised in a very religious household, as you all know. My dad's a Southern Baptist pastor. And so this was one of the first chapter books I ever read. Like I was very young. Like I want to say I was 6 or so whenever I read Chronicles of Narnia. It actually spawned a whole thing because we were driving to my granny's for Christmas. And my dad was like, this is a good book for you to read in the car. He figured out, even though I wasn't medicated for my ADHD as a kid, he figured out if I had distractions in long car rides, I was much more tolerable to be around. So he always had a book for me. And that year it was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And I read the whole book by the time we got to my granny's, which was just a couple of hours. And my dad didn't actually believe me that I had. So I had to do all these crazy reading tests. And that's how I like found out that I'm actually a speed reader. Like by like there's an actual standard for like, if you can read X number of words in a minute, you're a speed reader. But yeah, so that was like the first chapter book I really read. And then he bought me the big, thick thing with all 7 of them in it. I've had several different versions of it throughout the years. But yeah, I've read this book a billion times. Karina and I even went to the midnight showings for Prince Caspian and Voyage of the Dawn Treader when they came out. C.S. Lewis was a huge part of my childhood and my college years too, because I went to a Southern Baptist school. But yeah, for me, I think the Christ parallels in Aslan are pretty apparent in both the books and the movies. I think in the movie, it doesn't become as noticeable because Christ parallel is such a common story for the hero of any movie to go through.
That's true. It happened with Harry Potter.
Yeah. Like you can find a Jesus Christ metaphor in about any like hero narrative. Like you can make the argument for Luke Skywalker, for Harry Potter. So I feel like it's just less noticeable because of that. I don't think they took away from the context of the book. I actually think they did a pretty solid adaptation.
That's a very valid point. I didn't think about it that way.
But for those of you who don't know, just a really quick synopsis here. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe involves 4 siblings, Pevensey siblings, Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. The Pevenseys are sent to the countryside during World War II because of the Blitz, and their parents don't want them to be in London. So they're sent to stay with an old man, Diggory, right?
Yes.
Diggory is his name. And he is an old man who has a mansion in the countryside. This was actually a real and very common practice during the Blitz.
Oh yeah, definitely. It was to protect the children, to keep them, because they didn't know where the bombs were going to drop. And so they're like, well, we can't subject the children to this horror, so we're going to send them to the countryside to keep them safe.
So like, yeah, you would just send your kids off to people you didn't like even know, just to say. It's a very interesting part of history, but it's the first difference I see, because I'm going to come at this, as I always do, from a perspective of comparing and contrasting with Tolkien, because C.S. Lewis's book is for children. The Hobbit is for children, but the other ones are for adults. And there's a lot of things that they do similarly, and you can see each other's influence in their writing. But there's a lot of things they do differently too. And so of course I'm going to be drawing those parallels the whole time because I'm obnoxious. But that's the first difference we see, is like all of Tolkien's book takes place in an alternate world, whereas Lewis's takes place between 2 worlds, and the real world is dealing with the real issues that his country was dealing with at the time. Whereas Tolkien went through a lot of things, fighting in a world war himself and being injured. And he wrote those into his books, but more he let those experiences guide him instead of like referencing them directly, which Lewis is much more direct here, which is why I think it's so interesting how allegorical it becomes later on.
Yeah. It's very much at the beginning of it, you know, it's like there's Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy, who's the youngest. Peter's the oldest. It's kind of made clear he wants to kind of, you know, he doesn't want to get sent off with the children because he's been the man of the house since his dad went off and that kind of a thing. And so he kind of thinks he should go off, but he realizes his place is taking care of his siblings.
Yeah, it's very much the other authors that I guess Lewis has in common in this particular novel and the setup of this novel is very much like Alice in Wonderland.
Oh yeah, because we do have that the young girl falling through the portal into a different land.
So yeah, and again, you have to remember that Lewis was writing for children exclusively. And
yes,
in the stuff that you're mentioning about Peter is very. The characterization is very brief in these books. He'll give you 2 lines about them.
It's a blink and you'll miss it thing.
Because kids don't really need characterization as much as they like archetypes, and that's easier to write. And that was kind of in the style of the time, which is another thing that I think is interesting about the movies is that they gave the characters a lot more depth and nuance than the books did, because the books were written for a younger audience.
Yes.
But Peter does want to stay in the city with his mother, but he is ultimately sent to the countryside with his siblings, where they meet Professor Diggory, who invites them to just spend time around the house. He's kind of an eccentric old man. And then the story really kicks off when they decide to play hide and seek inside the house on a rainy day. And the youngest sibling, Lucy, climbs into a big old wardrobe that she finds in an empty back room. It's the only thing in the room. And she climbs in there to hide, and she keeps walking back and doesn't find the back of the closet. Instead, she finds herself brushing through evergreen trees into a snowy field in the middle of
with a lamppost.
With a lamppost. And
which Lewis only put in his book because Tolkien said no fantasy book can have a lamppost. And Lewis is like, I'm going to prove you wrong. I feel like Tolkien and Lewis were like really good frenemies sometimes.
Yeah, they definitely had differing views on how things should be done. Again, this goes back, I think, to the same thing of C.S. Lewis starting and basing in the real world and then suggesting that there's another world side by side with it, as opposed to Tolkien, who was like, this is a fantasy world. In the fantasy world, they don't have the things we have here.
No.
It's two very different approaches to writing fantasy.
And they're both still very common today.
Yeah, absolutely. But Tolkien, while Tolkien is maybe the father or the grandfather of the fantasy genre as a whole, especially like things that led to D&D and like the podcast, you know, get adventure podcasts. Lewis really leans more towards, though not completely in the direction of magical realism.
Yeah.
For the most part, the magic does not cross over between worlds in his books, but that's the first time that somebody was like, what if there was a lamppost in a fantasy land? What if there was a magic ring in regular, you know, middle-class London in the 40s?
Yeah, because the lamppost is supposed to mark the end of our world and the beginning of Narnia.
Yes. And
so it's kind of like that one last it's kind of like that one last lighthouse on the edge of the sea.
Yeah. Lucy finds her way into Narnia, meets a fawn who introduces her to the general locale, tries to kidnap her, you know, all the usual stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually she manages to bring all of her siblings back with her to Narnia. Now, the Narnians, the reason that Mr. Tumnus tried to kidnap her is because the Narnians are under the rule of someone called the White Witch. And
yes.
She has commanded all of the Narnians to bring her any children of Adam or Eve that should find their way into Narnia, because humans don't exist in Narnia.
They really don't.
Well, I mean, there's like the Tamaranians, like there are humanoid people they meet in Narnia later.
Yeah. But I guess that means they're not children of Adam and Eve.
Children of Adam and Eve are earthlings, I guess.
Yeah, I suppose.
For this to make sense, it has to be another planet instead of another.
Yeah, or another plane of existence that Adam and Eve were never on.
Yeah, well, I guess, and that's Lewis's argument. Because the biggest argument that Tolkien and Lewis ever had, fun fact, is whether or not The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was an allegory.
Now, and you all know how Tolkien loves allegory.
So an allegory, by definition, according to Webster's, is a story, poem, or picture that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning, typically a moral or political one. So an allegory, basically, you tell your own story, but through it are giving the details of another story that is trying to get some sort of moral point across, which is a really broad definition. And by that definition, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is an allegory.
Most definitely.
It's an allegory for the Christian savior story. However, C.S. Lewis was just as much of a prick as Tolkien and liked to split hairs and was like, it's not an allegory. It's a thought experiment of what would happen if
Jesus was a lion.
If Jesus came to a world other than our own, one that maybe didn't have humans.
And was a lion.
How would he appear to people? Yeah. And so Jesus ends up being a lion. Now that's splitting hairs. It's very clearly an allegory. But for these two men, because they were old white dudes who worked at Oxford, they...
That's a lovely gesture.
they made their living off of arguing over semantics. And so it actually was a pretty big fight between them.
Not as big as the fight between them having Father Christmas show up. I think I read somewhere that they stopped talking to each other. I've read at some points they stopped talking to each other for a couple of years, and then other things say they stopped talking to each other for forever after that.
Yeah. It's yeah. And we'll get to that when we get to Father Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
The point is, humans, earthlings, don't exist in Narnia, and this white witch wants them all brought to her if any should come in from another place. So Tumnus tries to take Lucy there, but ultimately feels guilty about it and lets her go. And she considers him a friend for that. And so she wants to go back and help him, convinces her siblings to come back with her, only to discover that Mr. Tumnus is gone.
Yes. The White Witch discovered that he had let Lucy go and was taken. And between then and now, her older brother, Edmund, has been enchanted by the White Witch and abandons his siblings to go be with her because she has bewitched him.
Edmund turns his siblings over to the devil for the shittiest candy that has ever existed.
I know!
When I was a kid and I read this book for the first time, Miyazaki, the filmmaker Miyazaki, is very, very well known for having animations of food in his movies that just look amazing.
I love Howl's Moving Castle.
Or think about any of the stalls in Spirited Away with all these foods. There's a very innate childhood nostalgia to like foods in fairy tales that you want to eat that just look delicious. And so I had that reaction to Turkish Delight as a child, hearing it described in this book. What I pictured in my head was more of like, do you remember the Viennetta ice cream? They were like really ice cream, and like you had to slice it. I pictured like slices of that dipped in like hot fudge or something. Like that's what I was visualizing was Turkish Delight. The way that he described it is so amazing and it sounds so good. And then imagine my despair.
But it's one of those things that like, is it the shittiest dessert ever in the real world? And Edmund just went with turning over his siblings because it was enchanted to be better than it really was?
I mean, there's that argument. The point is, I grew up and I went to France, and I was in France, and someone asked me if I wanted to get a box of Turkish Delight with them at the store, and I was so excited. So I said yes, and we got it, and it's gelatin, rose water, and powdered sugar in a cube. It's disgusting. But
you know how I feel about Jell-O.
In World War II London, them sugar rations
Yeah, any kind of sugar at that point was probably exotic and wonderful.
So the joke is that Edmund was on World War II sugar rations, and that's why he was willing to give up his siblings for fucking Turkish delight, even though it sucks. But the point
What
is,
would you give up your siblings for? What dessert would you pick to give up your siblings for?
I have some siblings I actively don't talk to, and there's no dessert in the world that's good enough to turn them over to somebody I think will kill them.
Yeah, I mean, if I have to pick between a live sibling and dessert, it's probably going to be a live sibling.
Maybe.
I don't know. It depends on how much he pisses me off.
Well, what would the dessert be if you were pissed off?
If I was royally pissed off, it would probably just be a white chocolate covered Oreo.
Those are good.
He would have to royally piss me off and get me in like a mind setting where I'm just kind of like, you know, where I've like let the dark side take over just a little bit.
Incredible.
But I would never do that.
No, of course not.
If you had to pick one, if you'd piss somebody off and like they weren't going to kill them, they were just going to be mildly inconvenienced, what dessert would you pick?
Probably homemade apple pie. Apple pie a la mode. I will do most anything for apple pie. That shit's my jam. Apple pie, best pie. You heard it here first. My wife called it a middling pie, and I wondered for a moment if I was going to have to divorce her. Anyway.
Yeah.
On track. We are suffering. We are struggling. So this basically is the instigation for their hero's journey, their traditional. We have to beat the White Witch. We have to
get Edmund back.
These they end up staying with some beavers, Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, and the beavers kind of explain the lore of Narnia to them. And explain how their brother is under the thrall of the White Witch, how the White Witch turns people she doesn't like into stone, how there is a great lion called Aslan that's supposed to save them all, and there's a big poem about it.
Once 2 daughters of Adam and 2 sons of Eve returned. Wait. Blah, blah, blah. 2 daughters of Eve and 2 sons of Adam returned to Narnia.
Me rolling into Narnia. I guess you don't want my help. I mean, I would be happy to participate in saving your stupid little planet, but as you can see, I am neither a daughter of Eve or a son of Adam. I am your worst nightmare.
Do I get all the Turkish delight I can eat if I'm friends with you?
We'll see.
Okay.
No, yes. So yeah, this is probably the most like high fantasy that he gets in this particular novel in the series. Is kind of talking about the prophecy and the siblings and blah, 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 blah. And so they have to take off on a quest to go and find Aslan, who is a big, giant talking lion. And he's Jesus.
He's Jesus. Basically, news of them being there prompts Aslan's return. And so winter starts turning to spring. But one of the big things that Mr. Tumnus tells Lucy when she first gets there is that it's always winter and it's never Christmas. And there's a point where they're running away and they hear sleigh bells and they think it's the White Witch. And surprise, surprise, it's Father Christmas bearing gifts. So Christmas has come, which basically after that, it's like the White Witch starts losing all of her power. So it's like spring comes, the world is reborn after we celebrate the birth of Jesus. Woo.
You want to tell our loyal listeners here about the fight about Father Christmas? Now that we've brought him into the story, do you want to tell them about the Tolkien Lewis fight about Father Christmas?
I have read in a couple of like I said, I've had several different sources. Some of them have said that this prompted, no matter what, Father Christmas showing up in Narnia, since he is a real world entity. So having a real world entity, like a lamppost, show up in a fictional fantasy world made Lewis and Tolkien have a gigantic fight about it. Because they would edit each other's stuff and all that stuff. And so
because not necessarily because of Father Christmas so much as like Saint Nicholas was a real person.
Yeah, Saint Nicholas was a real person.
So
again, it's having a real world entity show up in a fantasy world, like the lamppost. Something that exists in our world showed up in a fantasy world, and that's not really how it should work.
Elvis like rolled up to help Frodo and Sam get through the spider lair and return to the cave.
I feel like I've read a fan fiction like that.
Probably. But Tolkien hated it. Tolkien hated that. He didn't
absolutely hated it.
And it probably didn't help that, as we previously have established in our last episode, Tolkien has his own very specific vision for Father Christmas and what he's like. And so probably there was a certain amount of animosity because the character that he had already written was being portrayed differently by someone else.
Yes, exactly. My head canon is the correct canon, and I'm going to tell the author that. Which, by the way, when I'm published, if somebody pulls that shit with me, I'm going to be like, you're really going to argue with the person who created this character what this character would say?
Yes.
Really?
Death of the author, baby.
Death of the author.
I believe in extermination of the author. I believe we let them finish their work and then we kill them so they can't do any other work or tell us anything about the work that they have made.
Well, yeah, once you put it out there, it's out there.
Yep.
You don't go back and retrofit it.
Lucas. So a lot of the story from this point follows pretty traditional storytelling, and then of course follows through the crucifixion of Christ from the New Testament.
Yes, Aslan basically, because Edmund is a betrayer of his siblings, his life is forfeit to the White Witch, and so Aslan takes Edmund's place on the stone table and sacrifices himself for Edmund, and therefore wipes away his sins.
So Edmund is saved, but Aslan is dead, and they're all.
And Lucy and Susan are there as the chief mourners, like Mary Magdalene and Mary.
Yeah. Another interesting thing about Lewis is that he's a big, fat, huge, gigantic misogynist.
You have 5 minutes, go.
5 minutes. Oh.
5 minutes. 5 minutes, go.
That. No.
Okay.
So Lewis has written a lot. The Narnia books are his only children's books. And then a lot of his other work, he did some adult sci-fi, and then he did a whole bunch of theoretical religious writings. One of the most interesting is the Screwtape Letters, which features a demon called Screwtape writing letters to his nephew, another demon, teaching him how to be a better demon. And it's really interesting just from a storytelling perspective. But of course, he put in all of his personal religious worldviews within the context of the story. So it is very allegorical as well. But the worst offenses of his misogyny are in his sci-fi novels. The way that female characters get treated or even talked about is pretty unpleasant, which is a really kind of a common thing with straight male sci-fi writers. It's like they forget the genre was invented by a teenage girl. But yeah, they tend to like write these theoreticals like, oh, what if like children of men, what if humans couldn't give birth anymore? And so one woman gets pregnant, she becomes the most important woman on the planet. And again, framing this woman as only a mother, a whore, or a virgin, you know? And yeah, so he falls really, really badly into that. But my least favorite example of it would come in The Last Battle, which is the 7th and final chronological book in the Narnia series. It's also the last one he wrote, wherein Peter, Lucy, and Edmund get in a train crash and die.
Yes.
And end up in Narnia as heaven, basically. Mm-hmm. Susan is not with them because she had not wanted to travel with them because she wanted to go overseas to America to study abroad. But the book deadass is like, oh yeah, she was too involved in lipstick and stockings, so she's not here with you now. Like the book presents the fact that they died in a horrible train crash as a good thing. And it also suggests in the same breath that Susan is not going to get into heaven when she dies because she's interested in girly things. And that shit is all over his writing. And
femininity is the devil, apparently.
And you can even see it in in these earlier Narnia books, the way that Mr. Beaver talks to Mrs. Beaver. And then like the same thing you said here is like he's caught up very much in the imagery, the very Renaissance energy, not actually biblical energy, but Renaissance energy of the paintings where the primary mourners, the women have to be the mourners, and the primary mourners are the two Marys, Mary the mother and Mary the whore, actually, ironically. Or rather, she, I guess, is now Mary the Virgin because she has accepted Christ's forgiveness. Anyway, my point is, yeah, the way that Susan and Lucy are used in this novel is not as egregious as in his others, but it is pretty distinct that he just does not give a shit about women.
And that's our 5 minutes. Bravo.
And not to make comparison and contrast, because God knows Tolkien had barely any women in his novels, but at least they did stuff.
Yeah. Like, I mean, Galadriel's a badass bitch.
Everyone's got some interesting characterization in all the novels. But yeah, it's just very interesting because like the argument of, oh, it was just of the time. It's like, well, you see his contemporaries.
Well, no, it's not. That
women, but they don't.
That trope of the mother, the virgin, or the whore, you know, that has caused, I don't know how many mental breakdowns of somebody who has been raised in Christianity over their lifetime, speaking from personal experience.
Yeah. So anyway, as you might guess, if you've ever heard the Christian religion story, Aslan comes back to life the next morning.
He's dead, but not.
He's dead, but not. He comes back to life, and they have a big battle, and they fight the White Witch, and they kill her. And then
Lucy saves everybody with her healing potion.
Yeah, and then the Pevensies stay and become kings and queens of Narnia, grow up to be full on adults.
Yeah,
like
they live an entire life in Narnia.
Yeah, 18, 20 years pass, and then as they're hunting one day, they find their way back to the wardrobe completely by accident.
Yeah, they're hunting like a white buck or a white doe or something like that.
Stag.
And it's just, you know, they accidentally find their way back to the real world, and like maybe a day has passed. So Lucy, who was
hours even.
Yeah, Lucy, who was almost in her 30s, goes back to being a 7 or 8 year old girl.
Yeah.
And that has to be awful to have that knowledge and experience of like a grown ass adult in the body of a child.
This is another one of those scenarios where I think that that fans have in the time since something has come up with more interesting stories based on the premise. Because I'm more interested in the story of how they deal with that than I am.
For sure.
Narnia. And actually, Prince Caspian is probably
addresses it a little bit. The movie does anyway.
The movie is probably least loyal to the book of the three that they've made. But that's because it especially addresses the tension between Caspian and Peter, because Peter was High King of Narnia, and now Caspian is the one calling the shots, and Peter is a teenager again. And so they butt heads on that because Peter was in charge of the whole country for like 5 years.
Because at this point, Peter's like a 40, 50-year-old man in the body of a teenager.
And
which has to be
orders from another teenager.
Exceptionally frustrating.
Yeah. I find that to be a much more interesting thought experiment than Jesus Lion. Like, I don't dislike Narnia, but it's very simple. It's very much for kids. Like a lot of
it's very much there's good, there's evil, there's nothing in between. The White Witch is Satan, Jesus is Aslan. If you follow Aslan, that's the good, and the white. I mean, like, Aslan has the breath of fucking life in the book. Where his breath de-stones everybody.
My biggest problem with Narnia as an adult is just that I am an adult. I don't think it's a problem that the book necessarily has. I don't know though, because I have read books for similar age groups that have a lot stronger character development. I think about like the American Girl books, which are just pretty much only characters. And I think about some Roald Dahl, even though he was a racist old fuck. I think Dahl's novels do a better job of character development for children. Like you think about just Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, like he goes character development in that book than any of the Pevensies do in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So like you can have children's books that have that, But I can also understand why he didn't take time to do that since it was a children's book. But as an adult, it's very grating to me because I generally like stories for their characters above everything else. Like character before narrative for me, a lot of times, if you have an interesting character, I'll follow them even if I don't really care what they're doing.
Yeah, if there is a character I can connect with, that usually is more of a reason for me to follow through to the end of the book than just I'm thinking of when we went back and read Tithe, that the plot sounded interesting and like everything I wanted. Same thing with The Beautiful. The plot sounded interesting. I hated the main character so much that I barely could get through any of it.
So yeah, I just personally, I enjoy character development as part of a narrative. And it was just hard for me having these characters going through so much and not spending any time to see how that impacted them. Like they come across as very shallow, even the male characters, but especially like Lucy. Lucy is very clearly like the little hero girl, like she's the virgin archetype, whatever.
Yeah,
like,
she is definitely the virgin archetype.
And it's just a little grating for me now. Again, I can't say if that's just because I'm an adult or because I know that children's books can have better characterization. I don't think it's a bad book. I
don't think it's a bad book.
I don't love it nearly as much as I did when I was a child, which is a lot of the other ones that I loved as a child, like have stayed with me. And Narnia, it would not upset me to never read it again. Like,
yeah, I mean, Narnia for me is like, I love the world of Narnia, but I feel like it kind of isn't really, I'm trying to think of the right words for this. I love the world of Narnia. I love the idea of Narnia. I love the idea of like another mythical world running parallel to ours. I love the secret portal and the magic and all that kind of a thing. But I just kind of now that I'm older and it just doesn't speak to me the way it used to.
And the religious imagery is really heavy-handed.
Yeah. Like, the religious imagery is the thing that kind of turns it off for me. And I mean, for someone who is very, like, I'm not super religious. So having something where it's very blatantly religious imagery really kind of bothers me, because I know I've had some mild trauma at the hands of the church, which some people are a little bit more understanding of. I know you get it. But that's something that every time somebody brings up that it's like, oh, well, I'm a very religious person, automatically I probably will not like you. Because if that's one of the first things you say to me, that automatically says to me that you are fully supportive of the thing that traumatized me.
Yeah.
So and again, when I first read this book when I was 8-10 years old, that hadn't happened yet. And now that I'm an adult, it's like, yep, nope, going back to those memories. Don't like those. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah, I think I like the world building of Narnia. I love any portal.
Yes, my little striker.
I love the concept of portal fiction and fantasy worlds, but I would much rather read A Blade So Black than the Narnia Chronicles.
Oh, yeah.
Like I said, Narnia is still a classic.
It's it's a classic.
Lord of the Rings and Wrinkle in Time, Alice in Wonderland, all those kind of young adult, young reader stories that we all grew up with and loved. And like, that's always going to be happy memories and things that come with it. But I do feel like in this case, I have outgrown it, which is maybe a suitable story arc for me at Christmas.
Yeah, I guess it's a suitable story arc for me as well. I've outgrown it. Yeah, and just because we all leave our childhood doesn't mean it's, doesn't mean it's a bad memory.
Yeah. No, I would still give Narnia probably 3.
Yeah, I would give it a solid 3 as well.
Very, very much middle of the road. It's dependable. All right. So that gives you around 3 bottles from both of us. So yeah, read it if you haven't, although I imagine you have. Again,
yeah, definitely. Or go back and watch the movie.
Yeah, go back and watch the movies. The Walden Books movies are actually pretty good. Although I think they only did the 3 and they're never going to finish them, tragically.
No, I don't think they're ever going to do anything past Dawn Treader. Because Dawn Treader did not do well.
No, it did not. But there was a pirate ship in it, and I love that.
I know. Gotta love pirates.
We'll be doing the storied life of AJ Fickery, which we were supposed to bring you in November, and the Song of Achilles, which is going to hurt me very, very badly. So watch out for those 2 in January. And have a happy New Year's Eve at home.
Yes, at home. Order some Chinese food and play with your babies.
We're going to drink champagne in our pajamas at my house. And as always, you can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, or wherever you get your podcasts. And our website is literaturepodcast.com if you want to follow what we've been doing for the last couple of years.
Yes, and if you're feeling exceptionally generous, we do have a Patreon. Case is recently married. I am trying to raise 2 of these tiny little humans. And yeah, she says, please help my mommy. And I've just decided to kind of take a foray into trying to become a professional writer, and that's absolutely horrifying to me and terrifying. So wish me luck. But we also know times are tough, so if you can't support us financially, we would just appreciate it if you would tell somebody to listen to us or watch us on our YouTube channel.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for listening today, and we will see you next time. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. For more information, visit us at litliteraturePodcast.com or check out our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages. And remember, too much work and no vacation deserves at least a small libation. Cheers!